We're here with Mitchell Lazarus, who's got a long, deep history with the National Spectrum Managers Association. And I want to read a little bit from Mitchell's background to set the table for those of you who don't know Mitchell well enough, which of course is a fault of yours and not his. All right. Mitchell Lazarus has begun his professional life as an electrical engineer with a bachelor's degree from McGill University, a master's from MIT. He followed this with a PhD in psychology and brain science, also from MIT, and later a law degree from Georgetown University. Mitchell earned his living as an electrical engineer, a psychology professor, an educational reformer, educational TV developer, and freelance writer, before finally settling into a 35-year career as a telecommunications attorney, from which he's now retired. As a lawyer who understood the engineering, Mitchell specialized in working with the FCC to bring a new spectrum-based technologies to the market. And he also represented the Fixed Wireless Communications Coalition for 22 years. Mitchell's long list of publications includes the government warning label on alcoholic beverage packaging and a recent novel called The Implosion Method. Mitchell is the recipient of the 2015 NSMA Fellow Award for Lifetime Achievement. Mitchell, it's a pleasure to have you here. We look forward to your presentation today on public safety and the spectrum squeeze.
Joe, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I've spoken to this meeting in NSMA for many years. I always look forward to meeting all of them in person and hope that next year maybe we can meet in person once again. I'm going to try to share my slides, and Mariana or somebody will tell me if I do it incorrectly. Are you seeing my slides?
We are. It's looking
okay.
good.
I'm not, so we'll manage anyway. Stand by. Slides are not changing. Okay, there we go. The very first practical application of radio was to and from ships, and that was a public safety application, of course. Titanic is the best known example. And as radio expanded from sea onto land, the FCC has always given safety communications a very high priority in interference protection. As the spectrum becomes more congested and more people clamoring to use it, that protection for safety seems to be weakening, and I want to talk about that today. The first part of this talk, most people in the room know more about it than I do, so I will go quickly. And if you want to check email on your phone or something during this part, that's fine. I won't object. The spectrum, of course, is not fungible. Every radio application has its own best part of the spectrum for its own particular purposes. We're looking today at mobile data. And if you look at the factors at the top of the screen, range, penetration, antenna size, and so forth, the sweet spot for mobile data is between a few hundred megahertz and a few gigahertz. Roughly a decade of spectrum, and coming under enormous demand over the last 10, 20 years, and the next 10, 20 years promise even greater demand. All those phones, tablets, laptops, all the household gadgetry, Internet of Things, Wi-Fi enabled everything, all of these need this narrow range of spectrum, both for licensed, 4G, 5G, and so forth, and for unlicensed. Everything has to be crammed into this very small stretch of spectrum to work properly. The problem being that this piece of spectrum is fully occupied and has been fully occupied for decades by dozens of services, most of which long predate digital data. And the FCC, the last several years, I'm sure the next several years, one of its major tasks is to repurpose this piece of spectrum from its current uses into mobile data. There are basically two techniques for doing this. If the commission wants to add in a licensed service, most recently 5G, it does it by first clearing a stretch of spectrum and moving the incumbents to other frequencies, either nearby or somewhere else, and it then auctions off the cleared out space to new users, and it has to protect then the adjacent bands, nearby bands, from interference from those new users. Second technique, for unlicensed services, typically the FCC just simply drops in the new service on top of the old one, usually at much lower power, and then it has to protect the incumbents against interference from this new service. Not to give away the plot, but we're going to talk about two examples of this, one in each category. Wi-Fi adding into 6 gigahertz fixed service, which, as everybody knows, carries safety critical information. And secondly, 5G added into lower C-band, threatening radar altimeters at 4.2 to 4.4 gigahertz, much in the press late last year and early this year because of threats to aviation safety. We'll come back to those two, but I want to first talk about how these proceedings work in general. If you look at the record in these proceedings, you'll find both the incumbent and the newcomer claiming very high public interest in their services, whatever they are, and reams, literally, of detailed technical studies in which the newcomer shows it will not cause interference to the incumbents, and the incumbents show that the newcomer will, in fact, cause devastating interference to its operations. And we will explain how these discordant results get arrived at. Both sides use the same analysis. I mean, Maxwell's equations is the same for incumbents and for newcomers. And they often use similar interference criteria, but they still get very, very different results. And the reason is because they disagree on the starting assumptions. In these three categories, they disagree typically on the newcomer's transmitter characteristics, on the incumbent's receiver characteristics, and on what happens between those two in terms of the geometries of the relationships between the transmitter and receiver, distances, propagation, and so forth. And those different assumptions produce very, very different predictions about interference. You would think, or at least a naive person would think, that, well, just run a hardware test, set up the transmitters, receivers, and see if interference occurs. Sounds simple, right? And very often the FCC, more often the parties, a few times NTIA, has actually run hardware tests using the newcomer's transmitter, the incumbent's receivers, and actually run field studies or lab tests to evaluate interference. And guess what? The debate continues. Doesn't settle anything. Because the parties disagree on typically the four elements on the slide. Whether the test setup reflected the realities of operation in the field, whether the measurements were taken correctly, how the data were analyzed, and at the end, what all of that implies for real world operations. And in some proceedings, you'll find a record containing multiple tests, some proving interference and some proving lack of interference. And if you have a spare month to spare, go to the ultra wideband proceeding, which has tests, many, many tests showing totally just contradictory results. And before we get to the case studies, I want to just a brief note on the receiver problem. Transmitters, of course, as everybody here knows, are regulated for out-of-band emissions. Every rule section in the CFR has an emissions mask that limits out-of-band emissions from transmitters. But receivers are not regulated for out-of-band reception. There are 3-4 exceptions in the rules, but the vast majority of receivers have no limits on what they can receive in terms of passband. And a wide passband on the receiver, of course, makes it more susceptible to interference. There's more range of frequencies for it to receive interference on. So, well, why don't the manufacturers make better receivers? Well, two reasons. One is that to tighten the passband adds cost to the receiver, which of course nobody wants. And if you put very steep filters at the edge of the passband to create a very narrow, sharp passband, it messes up the phase relationships within the passband and impairs performance. So the manufacturers, understandably, make a receiver that works well in the environment for which it's intended. It will not receive interference outside its receive channel in that environment. But if a new service comes in later on, adjacent or near to the receiver passband, then that receiver may be vulnerable to interference from that new service. And the newcomers, of course, coming into the band, and their incumbents claim they're going to get interference. And the newcomers very often blame the incumbents' receivers. Low quality receivers are causing the problems. Not our fault, not our fault. We're not causing interference. It's those coming receivers the incumbents are using that's causing all the trouble. Well, we see this in both of the proceedings we'll talk about a little later. Remember Light Squared complaining about GPS receiver quality when they were being turned down by the FCC. It's a consistent source of debate. But the fact is, if you're coming into somebody else's spectrum as a newcomer, you have to deal with the receivers as they are at that time. You can't wish for better ones. You have to deal with what there is there. Perhaps coming out of the 5G altimeter problem, the FCC last month, just 4 weeks ago tomorrow, issued a notice of inquiry on whether it should establish receiver standards. Those with long memories will recall that the commission did the same thing back in 2003, 20 years ago, and terminated the proceeding with no action. Remains to be seen if anything will come out of this proceeding. I'm going to talk next about 2 case studies, and I'll take questions at the end if that's okay. Unless I say something wrong or unclear, in which case please do interrupt. First case study is one I think many of you know well. Many of you worked on this. Many of you lost sleep over this one. This is Wi-Fi moving into the 6 gigahertz fixed service band. Wi-Fi standard 6E, it's now called. The incumbent fixed service 6 gigahertz band carries a lot of business data, but it also carries safety critical information in the categories listed on the slide. It coordinates railroad trains so they don't try and be on the same track at the same time, going in different directions. That's a good thing for trains. Controls oil and gas pipelines so they don't explode. Balances electric grid, water utilities, backhauling 911 calls. And all of these parties participated in the proceeding and objected to the Wi-Fi service coming into the band because of safety considerations. I note the little box, I worked on this. I'm not impartial in this particular proceeding. The newcomer, Wi-Fi 6 gigahertz, comes in 3 flavors, but we're only going to talk about one. We're going to talk about the presently available for use, indoor only Wi-Fi at 30 dBm EIRP, where we will not talk about today higher power 36 dBm with automatic frequency control, which is coming this year, next year, the year after, coming soon. And we will not talk about the uncontrolled outdoor 14 dBm EIRP, which I think is still pending at the FCC. So we're talking today about indoor only at 30 dBm. Everybody in the proceeding agreed the vast majority of Wi-Fi devices indoors, 30 dBm, would not cause any trouble whatsoever to FS, because they'll be in the wrong place, on the wrong frequency, behind building walls, shielded by other buildings, terrain, ground clutter. The vast majority of Wi-Fi devices would be invisible to fixed service receivers. Everybody agreed. The fixed service people were concerned about a very small fraction of devices, and we never quite got a number on how small, but pretty small, that would happen to be situated in just the wrong place. They'd be on a frequency that the fixed service receiver is using. It would be behind a window, have line of sight to the microwave receiver, worst case in every respect. And we predicted that you would get interference from such a Wi-Fi device out to many, many kilometers. The problem is that the Wi-Fi people projected just under 1 billion with a B devices. Fixed service has just under 100,000 receivers. So I mean, do a little bit of math. Even a very small fraction of devices causing interference is going to cause a large number of interference cases because of the large number of devices involved. Well, the docket filled up with technical studies. We did some, they did some. The Wi-Fi interests predicted consistently insignificant chance of interference. And the fixed service people predicted statistically certain interference. Inconsistent results, right? About as inconsistent as they get. So we asked, why did the two sides reach such different results? And this is part of the answer. The fixed service people calculated using full authorized power, 30 dBm, worst case with a device behind a plain glass window, line of sight to the microwave receiver, so free space attenuation. They wanted the fade margins fully protected and half a dozen other items I couldn't fit onto the slide. The Wi-Fi people took the Wi-Fi power and multiplied it by their estimated duty cycle, 0.4%, which knocks the power down to 6 dBm. Well, that helps, I guess. They assumed there'd be building material between the indoor Wi-Fi and the outdoor FS receiver, and they used a combined weighted average of building materials. Instead of free space, they used the 1 and 2 model, which allows for buildings and ground clutter. And they allowed incursion into the FS fade margin, soaking up some of the interference. And taking all of those considerations together, they were able to knock down the probability of interference by a large amount. The summary of thousands of pages in the record comes down to this, I think, that the Wi-Fi people showed successfully that an average Wi-Fi device would not cause interference to the FS. The FS people showed that a worst case Wi-Fi device would cause interference to the FS. And both are true. And the record is confusing, and what went up to the commissioners is confusing, because both sides, I think the Wi-Fi people more to blame on this one, were not always entirely clear about what assumptions underlay which calculation. And there's instances where the Wi-Fi people argued that what they called corner cases, worst cases, would be very rare. But then if you dig into the math, you find that some of the assumptions they were using were not in fact worst case assumptions. So it's very difficult to sort out what the actual implications of their studies are. And I'm going to hold this aside, and we'll come back and look at how the FCC dealt with this. But first, I want to talk about the other case study, which is the introduction of 5G into the lower C-band. The incumbent are these radar altimeters at 4.2 to 4.4. It's a very simple device. It's a FMCW radar. It sends a beam down to the ground and measures the time for return and calculates the altitude and displays it in feet. The newcomer was 5G. The carriers paid $81 billion with a B dollars for the spectrum, and they're going to pay another 13 or more, we don't know yet the exact number, to relocate the incumbents to different frequencies. So they've paid close to $100 billion for the spectrum, and they want to use it. That number is part of why this debate became so contentious. In this particular case, unlike the 6 gigahertz, there is no frequency overlap. If you look at the numbers here, there's 220 megahertz separating the 5G from the radar altimeters. So why are we concerned about interference since they're not on the same frequencies? And of course, you folks know the answer. The 5G transmitters have out-of-band emissions, as all transmitters do. And the radar altimeters have out-of-band reception, as all receivers do. And if there's any overlap between the out-of-band 5G and the out-of-band altimeters, then interference will result. A lot of calculations in the record, some studies, and the two sides, again, unsurprisingly disagree. The aviation interests foresee plane crashes, large-scale fatalities from plane crashes due to malfunctioning altimeters. And the 5G interests say no credible evidence that the alternatives will be effective. Why do we get these different results? Well, here we go again. Again, totally different assumptions. The aviation people looked at the worst case of interference. They had high out-of-band emissions. And let me footnote here that the 5G people said that the aviation out-of-band emissions would have violated the FCC mask. So that might need adjustment. Altimeter off-channel reception, and this became contentious because there are many, many mix and models of altimeters in use, not just one. And they have very different receiver characteristics. So there's a lot of argument over which mix and models to use for the studies and for the analysis. Aircraft approaching the runway often pitch and roll, and that turns the underbelly of the aircraft more toward the horizon and makes it more susceptible to interference. And major argument over what the reflectivity of the ground should be for these studies. Low reflectivity results in low signal coming back to the altimeter, which makes the altimeter more sensitive to interference. The aviation people used foliage, 0.1% reflectivity. 5G people used low out-of-band emissions, lower altimeter bandwidth. They kept the aircraft flat and level, and they took their reflections off the runway, which is a much higher coefficient. And using those calculations, they came up with a prediction of negligible interference. Another layer of complication when this gets to the commissioners is that none of these studies, none of these tests predict interference as yes or no. What they do show is differing probabilities for differing degrees of interference. And again, with the footnote that the two sides in each proceeding had very different numbers for both the probability and the degree of interference. And the parties then disagree on, again, whether a given level of interference will happen often enough to matter. If it's once a century, nobody cares. If it's a couple times a minute, then we do care. Whether that level of interference will impair the victim receiver, and if that happens, whether bad outcomes will ensue. And you can argue at length on any of these points, and people have. So what reaches of the commissioners is what I'm calling a complex multidimensional maze of conflicting uncertainties. It's a mathematical mess. It's very hard to untangle into sensible decision-making, and the stakes are very high, especially when, as in these two cases, and of course that's why I picked these two cases, is when the incumbents are predicting that interference from the newcomers will threaten human safety. So this gets to the commission, and then what happens? Well, the final decision is made by the commissioners. There are 5 of them. Usually there are 4 right now. There's a vacancy. They're political appointees. They're nominated by the president, confirmed by the Senate. And of course, they're sensitive to political concerns. I mean, they're political appointees. That's where they come from. The 4 now in office are all lawyers. And the nominee pending in the Senate is also a lawyer. No technical backgrounds on the 8th floor at the FCC. Back in the old days, before the early 80s, between the FCC start in 34 and 82 or 83, there were 7 commissioners, not 5. And by convention, by tradition, 1 was an engineer. But for the last 40 years, there have been no engineers, no technical people at all on the 8th floor. I want to emphasize, and this is important, that I don't know of any case where an FCC commissioner knowingly put public safety at risk. They're well-intentioned people. They do their best job they can. And nobody, as far as I know, has ever knowingly made a decision that would harm public safety. But it's a complicated world. The records are complicated, and legally, the commissioners don't have to pick the side that made the best case in the record. they can pick any result that has at least some support in the record, even if other positions have greater support. And again, these people they're smart people, but they're not well equipped in terms of background, education, experience to evaluate the complex engineering arguments that fill the records. And they have to rely on the FCC engineering staff, which is excellent, to resolve the competing technical claims. The FCC approved both of these allocations. When they approved the 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi in the fixed service band, they said, and it's on the screen, that the chance of harmful interference is insignificant. That's a word lawyers love, insignificant, because it can mean different things to different people, but it sounds small, but it doesn't have to be. 1 in a million is insignificant to most people, but 1 in a million among a billion Wi-Fi devices is 1,000 interference cases, which maybe is not insignificant. Similarly, when approving the 5G, the commission said that harmful interference is not likely to result under foreseeable circumstances. Did not claim zero interference risk. The record that reached the commissioners, as I said, showed strong disagreement on how much interference protection is needed, and the record could have supported a wide range of decisions. The one point in the record that was not contradicted, everybody agreed, was that there's a very high public interest in expanding both Wi-Fi and 5G. The public wanted more spectrum, more access for their devices. And everybody also agreed that to give fixed service and the altimeters 100%, 100.00% full protection would have severely cut back on Wi-Fi service and 5G service. You could not fully deploy and also give those services absolute complete protection. So the FCC, the commissioners, in effect, accepted non-zero safety risks, small we think, but not zero, in order to gain the benefits of greater spectrum for Wi-Fi and for 5G. Now, if the engineers had all agreed that putting Wi-Fi into 6 gigahertz or putting 5G into C-band would have definitely threatened safety. If all the engineers and the proceeding had agreed on that, the allocation would not have happened. But when the risk assessments are contradictory, when there's plausible, credible arguments on both sides of the engineering, then public safety becomes one factor among many other factors for consideration. And in conclusion, to wrap up, the Congress has to, the FCC has to regulate in the public interest. That's part of the statute that governs their operation. But the FCC decides what the public interest is in a particular case. And in particular, it decides how much safety protection the public interest requires. Engineers are used to trade-offs, and regulation also requires trade-offs. You can't get everything you want. You have to get some of this and some of that. The FCC has to balance public safety against other public interest considerations, such as enough spectrum for all of us to use our phones when we want to. And when there is disagreement on the technical side, then of course it's easier for the commissioners to find that more spectrum for public use is in the public interest and easier to tip against safety considerations. And I'm afraid that these two proceedings are just the tip of the iceberg, that as spectrum demand increases, we're going to see more of these compromises, and we may see increasing interference threats to other public safety critical services. I'll stop there and take questions, but just before I do, I want to draw your attention, if you're an IEEE member, the July issue of the Spectrum magazine will have an article that covers some of the same material I just discussed, some more and some less. And when the article appears online, I will ask Joe to circulate it to membership. I will unshare my screen, and I will be interested in questions and discussion.
All right, fantastic. Thank you, Mitchell. And we look forward to that article, and we'll put it on our website and our LinkedIn and in our email distribution as well. There's a question here from George Kaiser. He says the FCC's definition of harmful interference, section 2.1 AC, gives a higher level of protection to safety services and radio navigation than it does for other services. Yet these other services often support safety services. Does this make a difference in these proceedings?
It's a really good question. It's one I avoided because it's complex.
Thanks, George.
Yeah, the definition of harmful interference comes in two parts. Public safety services, those designated as such by the FCC, and radio navigation, which includes the altimeters, are protected against anything which threatens their operation. It's a very, very high level of protection. Other services, which includes a fixed service, even though it carries safety information, it is not a safety service for purpose of the definition, is protected only against interference, which, hang on a second, I got it somewhere here, which seriously degrades, obstructs, or repeatedly interrupts the service. In other words, the Wi-Fi devices at 6 gigahertz are allowed to interfere so long as they don't seriously degrade, obstruct, or repeatedly interrupt. But the 5G is not allowed to interfere with radar altimeters if that would endanger the functioning of the service. Different standard. This distinction is totally missing from the Commission's decision in both proceedings. The Commission paid no attention to this distinction in making its ruling. If it had, I think the Wi-Fi would have come out the way it did, but the 5G might have come out differently. But the Commission ignored its own rule in this particular instance.
Interesting. Now, to take that to a logical end, in the event that ends up in a court, given Chevron deference and everything else, what kind of odds would you give that?
I've been following FCC court proceedings for 35 years. I have never seen the court overrule the FCC on a technical question. Never. The reason is that the judges in the courts are lawyers. A lot of lawyers went to law school because there's no math requirement. And they are simply not equipped to delve into the engineering and say, this is right and this is wrong. So all they can do, all they do is make sure the FCC follows the procedures correctly. And the reason the report and order in these cases runs to hundreds of pages is in order to make them appeal proof, to prove to the court that the FCC did in fact touch all the bases and consider all of the issues. And that's all it takes for the court to affirm. In fact, the court did affirm the 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi, finding the FCC had acted within its authority. I don't know of a court challenge that's been decided on the altimeters.
There's another follow-on question from George Kaiser. Do you think the $100 billion was a factor in the 5G decision?
Yes. I mean, it certainly gave the wireless carriers a lot of incentive to push very hard at the FCC to overcome the objections from the altimeter people. If the spectrum had been free, they might have thought less. On the other hand, the Wi-Fi spectrum at 6 gigahertz was free. There was no auction there, and yet the Wi-Fi interests pushed pretty hard. So it's hard to know. There's some parallel universe somewhere where that spectrum was free, and we need to see how it came out there.
Yeah. Do you feel that if you're looking at the FAA, FCC recent, live examples, so to speak, do you feel like there are other coming examples that could be optimized given what was learned with the FAA, FCC round 1?
Well, I really hope the FCC does learn from these. I'm retired, Joe. I've been retired for 2 years. I don't follow the developments on a day-to-day basis like I used to when I was in practice. And I'm sure there are people on this webinar who know much more about what's coming in the way of pending spectrum allocations than I do. I'm going to pass on that question. I just don't know. I hope the FCC learns from the past, but I'm not sure what that lesson would be. I'm not sure how they would handle the next one any differently.
Yeah. Mark Gibson from ComSearch asks, can you share your thoughts on the FCC's receiver standards NOI? Are you familiar with that at all? Or is that...
Yes. Yeah, I mentioned it in passing.
Yeah.
I think it would certainly help future spectrum allocations if the receivers the incumbents were using had narrower passbands. You could squeeze in more newcomers without causing interference to the incumbents. On the other hand, if you adopt the new receiver standards tomorrow, it would probably take 20 years before the receivers in the field were fully replaced. There are going to be a lot of wideband receivers out there, even when the FCC adopts new standards. So it's probably a good idea, but it's not going to have any beneficial effect for a very, very long time.
You got a lot of virtual thumbs up from that answer, by the way.
Good.
Another follow-on question, will the FCC and NTIA ever get together on spectrum usage, do you think? Do you think institutionally that's feasible?
Their interests are so different. A lot of my legal practice involved persuading both FCC and NTIA to allow a new spectrum user into the spectrum. And there was often friction between the two agencies, where the FCC wanted to do something and NTIA did not. Those of you who survived the ultra wideband proceeding or survived the BPL proceeding saw that firsthand close up, where the FCC said yes and NTIA said no. Usually the FCC got its way. I made enemies at some of the federal agencies that sit on IRAC over some of these issues. I mean, they're natural enemies. They have different interests. They pursue different goals. So yes, there's always going to be friction there, and we just have to live with it. As lawyers, you learn to navigate between them and try to get them both on your side and not after each other. But it's going to continue. That will not go away.
Megahertz, gigahertz, it all hurts kind of story.
Yes.
We have a question from David Meyer. Based on your understanding of how the FCC makes its decisions, what should an incumbent focus on when trying to protect their spectrum?
I think the incumbent's best argument is public interest, with public safety being a subcategory of that. An incumbent will do best if it can find a way to let the newcomer do most of what it wants to do and still protect what the incumbent most needs to have protected. One example, I don't know if any radio astronomers are on the call, but I've worked in a lot of proceedings that encroach on radio astronomy spectrum. The radio astronomer's lawyer, at least the lawyer for their trade group, CORF, was in my firm. So I could not oppose radio astronomers without creating a legal conflict of interest. So to avoid that, I would very often sit down with the radio astronomers and say, listen, we want to do this on these frequencies. Tell me where this causes you pain. And they would say, well, we have observation stations here and here on these frequencies. And we would negotiate a resolution where I could get what my client needed, but we would still protect what the incumbents most needed protected. And we bring that to the FCC as a solution, not as a problem. And that's my advice to the incumbents is decide what you most need protected and find a way to let the newcomers do what they want to do without encroaching on that core interest of yours.
Well, fair enough. And on that note, we're going to have to very peppy question panel here, but we're going to have to bring it to a close and go into our break prior to our next event with Diana Furchtgott-Roth, on GPS satellite and spectrum matters.